New York in the 1930s was a city split between fear and fury. The Depression had left people desperate, fascism was spreading across Europe, and anti-Semitic groups were trying to plant the same poison here. In Germany, Hitler had just come to power. In Yorkville, on Manhattan's Upper East Side, men in swastika armbands began marching through the streets shouting Nazi slogans. Most New Yorkers dismissed them as a sideshow, but for the city's Jewish immigrants, many only a generation removed from pogroms in Europe, it felt like a nightmare returning. What happened next became one of the most unlikely alliances in the city's history. Rabbis and community leaders quietly turning to gangsters for protection. It began in 1933, the year Hitler became chancellor. Across the United States, pro-Nazi organizations began organizing. The most visible was the German-American Bund, a nationalist group that claimed patriotism but mimicked the Third Reich in style and speech. They opened headquarters in Yorkville, held rallies in Queens and Brooklyn, and ran summer camps such as Camp Siegfried on Long Island and Camp Nordland in New Jersey. These places drilled young people in brown uniforms beneath both the American flag and the swastika. In those same years, Jewish war veterans and neighborhood associations were debating how to respond. Some leaders urged calm, fearing that violent retaliation would feed anti-Semitic stereotypes. Others believed silence was surrender. In Newark, prizefighter Nat Arno helped form a vigilante unit called the Minutemen. They patrolled Bund meetings, burst through doors, and broke up rallies with fists and clubs. Their message was simple: fascists would not march unopposed. The movement soon crossed the Hudson. In 1934, a Brooklyn rabbi, worried about Nazi agitators harassing Jews near Yorkville's Bund halls, sought help from an unlikely ally, Meyer Lansky. By then, Lansky was already a power in organized crime, known for building a national syndicate with Lucky Luciano. But he was also a proud Jew who despised Hitler's followers. When approached, Lansky agreed to help, with one rule: no killings. As he later recalled, "We wanted to show them they couldn't parade here, but we didn't want to make martyrs." Lansky organized teams of street toughs, Jewish and Italian alike, to monitor Bund activity. When meetings were announced, his men waited outside. If speakers shouted anti-Semitic insults or displayed swastikas, the gangsters stormed in. Tables flipped, flags ripped, and fists flew. Police reports from the mid-1930s document repeated brawls at Yorkville halls and German social clubs. One Bund newsletter complained bitterly about Jewish hoodlums breaking up our peaceful assemblies. The most famous confrontation came during a Bund rally on the Upper East Side in 1938, when hundreds of protesters clashed with uniformed Bund guards. Chairs were smashed, banners torn down, and a handful of Nazis ended up in the hospital. No one died, but the fights made headlines and discouraged public rallies for months. Not every gangster involved was as prominent as Lansky. In Newark, Abner Longy Zwillman, the city's leading mobster, funded similar operations. In Brooklyn, neighborhood boxers and dock workers joined the effort. They weren't fighting for money, they were fighting because no one else would. Even so, it's important to separate fact from legend. Later stories sometimes lump in figures like Bugsy Siegel or Abe Reles, but there's no solid record of them fighting Nazis in New York. The real core of the movement was smaller: Lansky's crews in Manhattan and Brooklyn, and Arno's Minutemen in Newark and northern New Jersey. They coordinated loosely through word of mouth, not through the national crime syndicate. The city's police response was complicated. The NYPD had to protect Bund rallies under free speech laws, and officers often formed lines between the marchers and the counter-protesters. Arrests happened on both sides, usually for disorderly conduct, but within Jewish neighborhoods, the police rarely interfered when toughs chased off Nazi speakers. The authorities called it keeping the peace. By 1937, the Bund was at its height, not its decline. They claimed tens of thousands of members nationwide and planned a massive rally for February 20th, 1939, at Madison Square Garden. More than 20,000 supporters filled the arena. On stage, Bund leader Fritz Kuhn stood beneath a banner of George Washington flanked by swastikas, railing against Jewish conspiracies. Outside, nearly twice as many protesters, unionists, clergy, veterans, students clashed with police trying to hold the line. Inside the garden, a lone protester rushed the stage and was beaten down by guards before being pulled to safety by officers. The spectacle horrified most of the country. After that night, the Bun's public support began to crumble. Later that same year, Kuhn was convicted of embezzling the Bun's own funds and sentenced to prison. When the United States entered World War II in 1941, federal authorities seized Bund properties and interned or deported its leaders. The organization collapsed. By then, the Jewish street fighters had already disbanded. Some enlisted to fight overseas. Others returned quietly to their old trades. Lansky stayed in New York, later rumored, though never officially confirmed, to have offered his waterfront contacts to U.S. Navy intelligence during Operation Underworld in 1942. Historians still debate how direct his role was. What's certain is that the mob's control of the docks made it useful for preventing Axis sabotage. Looking back, the story of Jewish gangsters battling Nazis feels almost cinematic, the underworld defending its own community, but the reality was grittier and more local. Most of the men involved weren't big-time criminals. They were ex-boxers, laborers, and young immigrants who understood one language: force. In a decade when anti-Semitism was tolerated in polite company, they chose confrontation over fear. Their actions didn't win medals, and they weren't officially celebrated. Yet they helped change the atmosphere of the city. After repeated clashes in Yorkville and Newark, open Nazi organizing in those neighborhoods dried up. Even before the federal government cracked down, the Bun's public rallies had become liabilities. Every meeting risked ending in a brawl. Meyer Lansky later said he had no regrets. "They had their meetings, we had ours," he told an interviewer decades later. "They wanted to hurt Jews, and I wanted to hurt them." Whether that quote is exact or embellished, the sentiment matched what many Jewish New Yorkers felt at the time. The police and politicians might debate civil liberties. The men in the streets believed survival came first. Today, little trace of those battles remains. The Bun's East 86th Street headquarters is gone, replaced by apartment buildings and cafes. Camp Siegfried on Long Island, once a playground for young fascists, is now a public park. Yorkville has long since lost its German identity, yet the idea that gangsters, men who broke laws for a living, once risked their lives to silence Nazis in their own city still captures the contradictions of New York itself. Because New York has always seemed like a city of lines and loyalties, law on one side, conscience on the other. Official restraint versus street justice. When the system hesitated, the underworld acted. They didn't do it for glory or forgiveness. They did it because, to them, fighting back was the only option. A few years later, young Americans, including the same immigrant sons who once brawled in Yorkville, would ship out to fight Nazis overseas wearing U.S. uniforms instead of street clothes. The battles in New York were smaller, dirtier, but driven by the same refusal to bow. If you walk through Yorkville today, past the bakeries and cafes that replaced the old beer halls, you'd never guess that swastikas once flew there. But in the 1930s they did, and the reason they didn't last wasn't luck or politics. It was because New York's Jewish community refused to be intimidated. When the hate came to their streets, they met it head-on. For a short, volatile moment in history, the city's gangsters, men usually feared by their own neighbors, became defenders, not of law and order, but of dignity. They fought for the right to exist in a city that sometimes looked away, and in doing so, they wrote one of the most unlikely chapters in New York history. That's how, long before the war began, New York's Jewish gangsters helped stop fascism's march right here at home, not with speeches, but with their fists.